that didn't know anything about God. He was outside of church, and he came to Christ as a non-believer that became a believer. Now, in our culture today, of course, we would look at someone like Paul, and if he had a conversion experience, we would treat that person as someone who was previously unchurched. But you got to understand, in his culture, up until this time, he would have seen himself. He grew up in the temple. He was ordained. He was a teacher. He was very learned. The church, as it was known at this point, was mainly being worked out in the synagogue, in the temple. So for practical purposes of this message, we can say he grew up in the church. That was my experience too. I grew up in the church. I was baptized at 11. And not because somebody made me. At 11, I was saying, Jesus died on the cross. He rose from the grave for me. I accept him in my heart. Now, I was saying that, but I have to be honest, I didn't know what it truly meant. Sometimes you can talk about stuff because you hear the preacher saying it. You hear the choir singing it. You hear deacons saying it. You hear the mothers of the church, and so you just go along with it too. I'm in the church. This is what everybody in the church is talking about, so me too. I'm ready to be baptized. And I went from being baptized, and just imagine Efrem Smith with the same loud-mouthedness and very talkative at age 11. So by age 12, I'm in front of the church. I'm singing. I'm doing stuff. I'm a junior deacon in the choir, junior usher, junior everything I could be in the church. But I had a personal experience with God the summer after my junior year in high school. An experience outside the church. I wasn't in the bubble. It was an outdoor evangelistic outreach where the church was willing to come outside the walls, have food, set up a stage, have Christian rap groups. And I was sitting on my bike, and I experienced God at my level. Later, I was at a youth camp. And I heard a message, I'll never forget it. A guy named Buster Soaries preached a sermon called Agape Love. No catchy, fancy title, Agape Love. And man, I found myself crying, saying, I want to experience that God. What I'm trying to say is sometimes we have to separate being churched from like these awesome, kind of hard to describe, outside the temple, outside the church building, experiences with God. Is there anybody in here, you don't have to raise your hand, but have you ever been outside a church, away from a choir, away from a preacher, but you know that you experienced God in a powerful way? God spoke to you. God invaded your life. God's presence. You were not in the bubble, but you experienced him. Maybe it was in your home. Maybe it was on the street. Maybe it was somewhere where you weren't supposed to be that you thought up until that point, God doesn't go there, and God met you there. Paul was on his way to persecute believers, and he met God, and his name was changed. His nature was changed. What I'm trying to say is that's where worship should begin. Worship, an authentic worshiper. If you want to go beyond ordinary worship and you want to live the life of extraordinary worship, it doesn't begin with just repeating the words you hear church people say. An extraordinary life of worship begins where God personally met you. A personal experience. Your mama didn't create it for you. Your daddy didn't create it for you. The preacher didn't force it on you. People didn't make you do it, but God showed up and you have not been the same since. That's extraordinary worship, where you're raising your hand not because they tell you to. You're crying not because somebody forced you to. You're singing not because everybody else is singing, but you're worshiping because you remember that day still now when God met you. And God continues to meet you and shake you and challenge you and change you and rip stuff out of you and force you to grow up. That's worship. Worship is when you go, I have lived the unexplainable. I was broken and God met me there. I was hurting and God met me there. I was wicked and rebellious, but God still loved me enough to meet me in the midst of my brokenness and my wickedness and my rebellion and my lying and my hiding and my concealing. And God still went through all of that and loved me. That's why I worship him. That's why I raise my hand. That's why I find myself crying. That's why I'm so hungry for him. Not because the preacher, but God himself did it. I want to push you from ordinary worship to extraordinary worship based on your personal experience with God. Everything else is going through the motions. Everything else is just religious jargon. Can you remember the day that God showed up in your life? Have you ever felt God's love in a way that you still can't put words to it? Can you testify that when you were on your way to do some dirt, God met you and you became a disciple? This is a worship that remembers where you came from. Stop worshiping as if you've always been righteous. Stop worshiping as if you've always been saved. You are saved and you are on the journey of being saved at the same time. You have been made righteous and are on the journey of living out your righteousness at the same time. Paul, before God met him on the road, thought he was righteous. Thought he knew God better than anybody. But God knocked him to his knees, and his life was never the same. We ought to worship God out of gratitude. Extraordinary worship is worshiping God because where God has brought us, we don't deserve it. We worship out of gratitude for his grace and his mercy and his love for us anyhow.